Again, good afternoon. It's a distinct pleasure and a great honor to be here giving this talk. I'm delighted and very appreciative of the Ngi An Si's financial support that made this visit of mine possible. I also want to thank all the colleagues from the RSIS who have contributed to making my life much easier. Ambassador On, Dean Emmers, Mr. Sung, where are you, Mr. Sung? Right here in front of me. And last but not least, I'm looking for Miss Cindy Go. Where is she? I want to say, okay, she's outside. I just want to say a personal note of thank you, of gratitude, of appreciation, that you have all made my visit rewarding and pleasant. Thank you all very much. And also thank you, the audience. I know how busy you must be, so thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to visit today. I hope that I can make your visit rewarding. I'm going to, quite frankly, throw a few stones, be very critical of Graham Allison among other people, and I hope that he will forgive me if I'm too outspoken, too provocative, too out of line, that you will forgive me as well. So again, thank you all. I have slides prepared, but I think I'm not going to follow the slides methodically in orderly fashion. Instead, I'm going to highlight my talk by enumerating a dozen or so points, 13 points if I counted correctly. You can get, if you're so interested, you can get the slides from Miss Cindy Go from RSIS. She should have them, and you can write to her, I hope, to ask for these slides. And I have also written an op-ed essay for RSIS. So if you are interested in probing more the material of my talk, you can ask for this op-ed piece. And finally, my talk is also organized around a book that I have forthcoming from the University of Michigan with the same title, Thucydides Trap, Historical Interpretations, Logic of Inquiry, and the Future of Sino-American Relations. Okay, so as Dean Emmers has said, Thucydides was an ancient Greek philosopher, theologian, and military strategist. He lived about 2,500 years ago when the ancient Greek world was in turmoil. There was a war, the Peloponnesian War, fought between two sides, two coalitions of Greek states, one coalition led by Athens and the other led by Sparta. This war ended very badly for all Greeks, leading to the ruin, the total collapse of the ancient Greek world. Thucydides is well known as the father of modern realism, whereby the claim is made that in international relations, power and only power matters. Morality, ethics, and law do not matter. He is well known, and deservedly so, for his portrayal of the so-called Melian dialogue, whereby it was recorded that the envoys from Athens warned their counterparts from Melos, a small Greek state, telling Melos that it must take the side of Athens in its fight against Sparta. And the memorable phrase uttered by the Athenian convoys was that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer they must. The world out there is a dog-eat-dog world. It's a ruthless jungle of the survival of fittest. There's no room for law, morality, ethics, or pity for that matter. But today, I'm here to talk about another thing, another issue, another topic that Thucydides had made famous. Specifically, his epithet in writing the history of Peloponnesian War, whereby he remarked that the root cause for this war between Athens and Sparta had to do with the rise of Athens and the fear this rise created on the part of Sparta. That the rise of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta was the basic reason, the cause for the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Now, as Dean Amos just mentioned, Graham Allison, the former dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, wrote several well-known pieces reminding us of the so-called Thucydides trap. The war stemmed from the catching up of a rising power, reaching the point of parity or even overtaking an established ruling state. Obviously, his concern is that with the rise of China, there may very well be a danger, an elevated danger of a clash between the United States, the established ruling power, and China, the rising power. As Dean Emmons also has mentioned, Graham Allison claimed that he studied 16 past historical cases of such power transition. Again, power transition means the overtaking or the reaching of parity by a late rising power to the point of matching the established ruling power. There have been, according to Allison, 16 such cases, and in 12 of them, war was the result. While saying that he does not believe that a clash between the United States and China is inevitable, he clearly is concerned that the danger for such a clash has become elevated. So what do I want to share with you today? Put in a nutshell, I think Graham Allison's thesis is bad history, poor political science, and dangerous policy discourse. In other words, I'm going to throw a few stones, and I hope that you will indulge me and bear with me. Let me begin by enumerating. I should not forget about this. Let me see. The control is here. So let me see whether or not I can. Okay, there we go. So I've already covered the first part of what Thucydides' trap is all about and the historical cases. Let me begin by stating my first concern, the reason why I have trouble agreeing with Graham Allison's warning of Thucydides' trap. And that has to do with the fact that what he offers is a monocausal explanation. Monocausal meaning that he points to a single reason, a single cause for the outbreak of war. I think social phenomena are too complicated to be explained by one single cause. Usually, social phenomena are the result of a combination, a confluence of factors, rather than one. We know that World War I was triggered by the catalyst of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. But prior to this incident, there had been arms races, there had been a bifurcation of alliances in Europe, and a buildup of distrust between the leaders of Europe. So even if Sarajevo had not happened, there could be other triggers that could have caused World War I. In other words, what I'm claiming is that we need to recognize the circumstances that conspired to create a very dangerous brew. If I may, let me just use an analogy. If you ask why there is a forest fire, I can point to a very long dry season or several dry seasons without moisture, precipitation, that there is accumulated debris on the forest floor, that the terrain where the fire broke out could be inaccessible to the firefighters, and the windy condition was not helpful, right? And finally, whether or not it was a discarded cigarette butt by a careless smoker, or a downed power line, or even a lightning strike. Any one of these could have set off the forest fire. And by the same argument, I'm saying that there are lots of factors that combine to make the momentum of war seemingly unstoppable or difficult to reverse. And social science has come a long ways before we settle for a monocausal explanation. Monocausal here referring to what? the power transition, the catching up of a late rising power to the point of an established ruling state. It is, in my view, too simplistic. It ignores, overlooks other auxiliary reasons. The second reason that I would like to point out is this. There is a missing link, a key missing link. As I've just quoted Thucydides to be saying, it was the fear that the rise of Athens caused on the part of the Spartans. Yet, work by Graham Allison and by other students of international affairs have so far totally ignored, disregarded how systemic level changes, namely power transition, changing, shifting power balance between two countries, could affect individuals in terms of their emotions, their judgments, whether that be fear, jealousy, envy, overconfidence, arrogance, anxiety. None of these people have tried to link macro-level systemic changes, shifting power balances, to human judgments and emotions. Therefore, the missing causal link. A third point that I want to make is that there is an important point about human agency. By human agency, I mean people make choices, even though people do not necessarily make choices under the circumstances of their choosing. Decisions on war and peace are made by people, individuals, and not somehow mysteriously caused by macro-level conditions. So the question then comes up, how do people go about making decisions? Thucydides' trap strikes me as a case of structural determinism, arguing that somehow circumstances dictate, whereas I would argue that human agency plays an important role. Specifically, I would argue that scholars and officials in Beijing are not unmindful of what has happened in history. They clearly are aware of Thucydides' trap. They clearly have tried to learn from Germany's war with Britain, how the shifting power balance between these two countries had triggered or contributed to two world wars. And they have also tried to study how the United States was able to catch up to Britain and succeed Britain as the world's hegemon peacefully. So again, people try to study history. We are not, by we I mean human beings, are not boxed in, we are not robots, we are not trapped by circumstances. We have certain discretion, even though our discretion may be limited by our circumstances. Still, a fifth point that I want to make, and this I think is very important. Thucydides' trap is an invitation by Professor Graham Allison to you and me to imagine that somehow contemporary United States is a replica of ancient Sparta. And asking us also to imagine that China is an analog to ancient Sparta or vice versa. That ancient Sparta, did I misspeak? I think I just misspoke. That ancient Sparta provides an analog to the United States. That the rise of China creates fear on the part of Sparta or the United States. Now, for any of us who have passing acquaintance with Greek history, Greek politics, we immediately will realize that the analogy does not fit very well. Why? Because Sparta was an agrarian society. Sparta was an authoritarian polity ruled by oligarchs. That the oligarchs of Sparta was constantly in fear of revolt by the helots or the slaves. And Sparta derived its strength from its infantry, fighting in formations of phalanx, right? The famous hoplites. Sparta was a land power, an authoritarian system, an agrarian society. In contrast, Athens was a democracy by the standards of its day. Athens was ambitious, seeking to build an overseas empire, and Athens' power came from its navy. Athens was basically a maritime power, And of course, it thrived on overseas commerce. Now, immediately, by pointing to these features of Athenian and Spartan societies, of their economy and their military orientation, you will note that Sparta does not offer exactly a replica for the United States, nor Athens for China. That there are some very serious discrepancies in the application of this analogy. Following on, if I still am able to keep my number system correct, very Chinese way of doing things. Point number 5. Thucydides, 6 or 5? Sorry, I misstepped. Somehow I missed it. You're keeping track, keeping me honest. So let's say 6. We are supposed to forget, ignore, overlook what have happened in the intervening years since the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, 2,500 years. What has happened during this time period? The advent of the modern state system, the introduction of nationalism, which makes conquest unrewarding, and of course, the invention of nuclear weapons. Do these changes, just to mention a few, make analogies borrowed from 2,005 years ago problematic and questionable? Specifically, you and I may want to ask, what would make the United States and China fight? What would they be fighting over? What would be worth their while to risk mutual destruction? That question of what to fight over is left unanswered in Professor Allison's treatise and in others who talk about power transition. Following on the next question, and number 7 now, if I'm still following the track, if we stop and think for a moment, there's something called, where is it? Let me just go to there's something called idiosyncrasy and irrelevance. And as I have said, I'm not following the order of the slides methodically. What do I mean by irrelevance and idiosyncrasy? These are fancy words referring to the following. Does the alleged cause always lead to the same outcome? Does X, the independent variable, power transition, always produce war? Or sometimes war follows, but sometimes war does not follow. Clearly, if we were to pause and think for a moment, all of us immediately will realize that, for example, in the case of Prussia and Austria, the rise of Prussia did end in a war between it and Austria, the brutal war, right, of 7 weeks, fighting over who should be the leader of the German-speaking states. But at the same time, all of us know that the United States rose to overtake Britain without causing a war between these countries. So here the ostensible alleged cause, power transition, sometimes led to war and sometimes led to what? Peace, peaceful transition. Idiosyncrasy, the same alleged cause sometimes produces Y and sometimes produces non-Y. A moment's reflection will also tell us that even in the absence of power transition, war can take place. All of us know that the United States and China had actually already fought in Korea in the 1950s, long before anyone has talked about power transition. So war can occur without, in the absence of what? Of power transition. The alleged cause. To put it differently, power transition is neither necessary nor sufficient for a war to occur. And Graham Allison clearly has not made that clear. Number 8, dubious selection criteria. Unclear standards for inclusiveness and exclusion. One of the 16 cases by Graham Allison points to Sweden overtaking the Habsburg Empire, causing war between these countries. But for some mysterious reasons, he overlooks the Spanish-American War, whereby the United States took over Guam, Puerto Rico, invaded Cuba, and sought colony in the Philippines. He did not look at the American-Mexican War, whereby the United States conquered all the states, or nearly all the states, that today constitute Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. So some wars are included, other wars are excluded, and the criteria for inclusion, exclusion are not clear. And more importantly, for those who live in Asia, who remember Asian history, there have been many wars waged by ruling states, Britain and France, against Asian countries. Colonial wars, like the Opium Wars. Wars can be waged by ruling powers against declining states, like the Qing Dynasty or the Ottoman Empire. All these wars were, for some reason, excluded. So, biased selection of cases. It is also now clear which countries should be construed as rising states and which countries should be interpreted as ruling states. For example, Allison pointed to the Russo-Japanese War. Who of these two countries, which one of these countries should be considered to be a ruling state and which one should be considered as a rising state? If anything, both of these were rising states fighting over the spoils of Northeast Asia. To give you another example, one of the more questionable, in my view, of his selection of cases has to do with Germany, specifically Germany from the late 1990s up to the year 2017, very recent. He cites Germany's peaceful overtaking of Britain and France, which to him are quote-unquote ruling states. As late as 2017, Britain to France, to him, are quote-unquote ruling states. Now, why should I bring this up? At the same time, he ignores the peaceful overtaking of Russia, the Soviet Union, of France and Britain, the same countries, by Japan, or China for that matter, overtaking France, Britain, Russia, and Japan. And in the aftermath of all these overtakings, war did not happen. So again, selective biased selection of history, picking some historical cases while ruling out others. The point that I want to make is that of the 16 cases that Dean Emmers has mentioned, there are lots of apples, oranges, and pineapples. And some fruits are left out of this list entirely, such as the Opium War, such as the Crimean War, such as American-Spanish War, such as the American-Mexican War. Highly questionable social science practice. I think I have lost track of my numbers. My number here is number 10, and forgive me if but don't worry about it. I will just quickly try to conclude the highlights of my remarks before I exhaust your patience. What is the proper unit of accounting? Now, Allison, in pointing to Sparta and Athens, in pointing to China and the United States, clearly has been thinking about bilateral power balance, bilateral. State A versus State B, one country versus another country. But if one were to pause and think for a moment, one immediately can raise some questions about whether or not states should be the proper unit of accounting. Going back to World War I and World War II even, should we consider, quote-unquote, Britain, that is to say the British home islands, as one entity? Or should we think about the British Dominion, the British Empire as a unit? If you consider the British Dominion, which I would contend, because Indians, Nepalese, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders did fight on the side of Britain, and by that unit of accounting, Germany never overtook Britain. Indeed, if Germany had overtaken Britain, then why should Germany wage a war? It could have waited for the trend to be its friend, to have seized mastery of Europe without waging a war. If Germany had already overtaken Britain, then Germany should have won World War I and World War II. The answer why Germany lost World War I and World War II has something to do with what? With the British coalition being much, much stronger than what? Than the German alliance. Now, why should I harp on this? To put it very simply, people in Beijing are not clueless, are not overlooking the fact that if push comes to shove, there should be a contest between the United States. Whom can China count on to be fighting on its side? Burma, Cambodia, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela? And whom can the United States count on? So this very notion of one state versus another state is totally what? Alien to me. Just doesn't make sense. I think, and I'm speaking as an American, I think the United States can very well count on Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Britain to be on its side. No doubt. It's the coalition that matters, not country versus country. Number 11, we have not talked about what counts as power. Allison talks about, his colleagues talks about power transition. So how do we know China is catching up? Or Germany was catching up to Britain and China is catching up to the United States? What is power, in other words? If by territorial size and population size, of course, China has always been very big. But clearly, none of us will say population size and territorial size is a valid measure of national power. If so, the Soviet Union would be the most powerful country, and China should always be the most powerful country. In actual history, it's the gazelles, the small countries that has entrepreneurial talent, elan, if you will, innovative capacity, industrial skills, social cohesion. These gazelles have run circles around the elephants. And what do I mean by gazelles? Which countries? It's those foggy little islands in the North Sea that ruled half of the world. It's the Netherlands. It's the Portuguese. And not the elephants. So what Allison has overlooked is innovative capacity, social cohesion. There are countries that punch way above their weight. Israel would be one. Singapore, if I may, is another one. Punching what? Way before your weight. There are others who are sluggish giants who never wake up. So it's a mistake just simply to look at industrial output, export volume, population size, steel production, and how many infantry do you have in your People's Liberation Army. It's silly. It's productivity and innovative capacity that counts. It's quality and not quantity. And Allison and his colleagues have never been clear about what do they mean by power. How do they know power transition is taking place? I have 3 more points and I will come to the conclusion, and I would very much like to invite your feedback and questions. I submit that Thucydides' trap, this discourse is reckless and dangerous. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of Chinese policy, and indeed of history of World War I and World War II. Plainly speaking, and you can ask me questions later on, it has been a fundamental misunderstanding of German diplomacy. The Kaiser of Germany in World War I and Adolf Hitler of World War II did not want to fight Britain. They saw Britain to be a member of the Anglo-Saxon race. Their aim was very much the rising colossus to their east, Russia or the Soviet Union, Lebensraum. The Kaiser and Hitler had tried to do everything to keep Britain neutral out of the fight. that Britain ended up fighting Germany was not because Germany wanted to challenge Britain, but because it had failed to keep Britain on the sideline. And Germany was not trying to seek global hegemony. It was trying to secure its mastery of Europe, regional contest, rather than global challenge. So what does that have to do with China? China, I will submit to you, is still today a regional power. It has refrained from challenging American interest, leadership, in areas where the United States has claimed to be important to its vital interest. Specifically, China has not interfered in Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, regardless of what you hear and said about Venezuela or Cuba. China has refrained from trying to insert itself in Europe. And China has so far not tried to push its weight around in the Middle East, 3 regions. China has remained focused on its near abroad, its vicinity, borders around China. And if there should be a war, a clash between China and the United States, my personal interpretation, I submit to you, is that because China wanted to challenge U.S. global leadership, but rather because China has been unable to keep the United States out of what it considers to be its domestic affair, namely Taiwan. If there should be a clash, it's because China has failed, its diplomacy has failed to neutralize the United States, not because China wanted to fight the United States. Fighting the United States would be the last resort, not the first preference of Beijing. And talks about Thucydides' trap is a fundamental misunderstanding, construing a regional contest on China's doorstep as a global challenge to the United States. Don't forget what happened in Korea. China entered into Korea not because it wanted to challenge the United States in Korea, but it was trying to defend its border. MacArthur was talking openly about rolling back communism in Asia. Let me finish my 2 more points and I will shut up. I'm sorry I have not rolled forward the slides, and you can get the slides anyway from Miss Go. 2 more points and I will shut up. Why did Germany start World War I and World War II? If Germany was already on the rise, catching up or even having caught up to Britain, why then bother to fight a war? Why not just wait out? Let the trend, as I have said, be your friend, so that you can secure mastery of Europe without having to fight a war. To answer this puzzle, I argue that Germany's true target was not Britain, not world hegemony, but rather the country to its east. Central Eastern Europe, specifically Russia, for its resources and geographic space. The true target of Germany in both world wars was Russia and the Soviet Union. To put it differently, Germany started World War I and World War II with Russia in mind, the Soviet Union in mind, with what I would call the preventive motivation. What do I mean by preventive motivation? German leaders realized that time was not on their side vis-a-vis the Russians, not vis-a-vis the British. Russia, the Soviet Union, was a rising power. And Germany decided to strangle the baby in the cradle, not waiting further before the window would close, before it would be too late for Germany to wage a war of conquest against Russia, the Soviet Union. Hitler, in black and white, said the true target for German expansion was Russia, the Soviet Union. So waging World War I and World War II again was an attempt by Germany to seize a closing window of opportunity before Russia became too strong. Preventive motivation. Now, some of you may already made the connection. The most dangerous time for a rising power is when it is in the process of catching up, but not having quite caught up yet. It is at that time it could be the victim of preventive motivation. So the stronger but declining hegemon may start to wage a war before it's too late. And Washington under Bush did explicitly state this preventive logic. Against whom? Against Saddam Hussein, saying that the United States cannot afford to allow Saddam Hussein to come to possess nuclear weapons. The time to strike is before Saddam Hussein gets his weapons of mass destruction. Preventive motivation. And Chinese leaders are not oblivious to that. And Professor Allison simply overlooks that, assigning the blame for a war to the greedy, ambitious agenda of a rising power without asking whether or not the insecurity of a declining power might incline it to wage a preventive war before the window closes. Now, my final point. Going back to my earlier question, why do states fight? What would be at stake for China and the United States to fight over? Obviously, the rising power wants to have something. It believes that its rising power entitles it to more say, a place in the sun, a greater voice, more respect, greater dignity, more status. The question then is this: why would the rising power not get the greater dignity, the greater respect, the higher status, a place at the table that it wants? Maybe it's overreaching, it's asking too much. And maybe the declining powers refuse to yield. Maybe some countries that are losing their power refuse to downsize their role, to trim their international mission, to insist, if I may, like Britain and France, to be treated as great powers when they are not great powers, to hang on to their seats in the Security Council. So let me translate this into English for you. It takes two to tango. It takes two to fight. Maybe the greediness, the ambition of the rising power having something to do with conflict, with a clash. But part of the responsibility is also for declining powers to refuse to make accommodations, to make adjustments. There are plenty of institutional, political, and psychological reasons for why declining powers refuse to trim their roles, to downsize their international obligations, to insist on being treated as great powers when they are in fact no longer entitled to the same treatment. I'm sorry I did not get to my slides, but as I say, you can ask Ms. Go for that, but I did accomplish my mission of going through my 13 points, and maybe it's 14 points, I don't know. I will shut up and ask for feedback from you. I've been very outspoken, I'm transparent, I throw stones, and in the interest of inviting feedback.